Okay, this is to be entitled The Truth About the Lee County Smear. Three, two. All right, listen up. I've been waiting a very, very long time to do this one, about a decade. This one is about one of the most important of the false accusations that they've been selling you for years now, kind of protecting that conviction all this time. This, in a lot of ways, is the most important of the smears. And as a result, this is probably one of the most important corrections I need to make, the most important thing that they have repressed. Therefore, one of the most important things that I need to finally, after all this time, be able to express. Now, get this: it's been about 11 years or so, and this is actually my very first chance to publicly talk about it. Now, to be sure, I had covered all of this already with the Netflix series crew, the Kings of Tupelo crew. I gave them the true receipts. I showed them everything. But guess what? They didn't bother telling you or showing you that truth. They didn't show it to you. So, and why that is, I still have absolutely no idea. But I want you to think about something. If you want to smear someone, if you really want to paint a picture of a person that's so horrible that no one would dare support them, especially politicians or powerful people who otherwise would have just raised objections. What do you think is the worst possible thing that you could accuse somebody of? The one thing which instantly puts any man, and it's always a man, at the very bottom of some social caste system, the legal caste system, what one charge makes you a complete pariah? Which specific charge causes everyone, family, friends, acquaintances, whatever your powerful advocates, what would cause the most damage? What would cause the entire planet to just flee for the hills? Well, there's really only one: child molestation. That's right. If you paint someone as a big perv, then their credibility is forever shot. You don't even need a conviction. All you need is the accusation, because at that point, the suddenly accused could really say 1 + 1 = 2, and no one would believe him. Prosecutor or cop, they simply use the word child and victim in the same sentence, and it's over. There's no recovering from that ever. And you know who knows that? Obviously, prosecutors do. So do judges. So does law enforcement, like sheriffs, like Jim Johnson. And dutifully, the news organizations, they always just jump aboard the prosecutor's train, and with zero chance of impartiality or even any scrutiny at all of the accusation itself. And they do so with kind of a cultish obedience. So let's look at the actual facts now of the Lee County nonsense. And I say the actual facts because
This call is from a federal prison.
you never got those. Why? Because Sheriff Jim Johnson, he didn't want you to know any of the actual facts. So the propaganda press, they didn't bother to press. So here's what you think you know from 2013, from what you were told. Seemingly, out of the blue, on January the 18th, which was a Friday night, I think, the television news in Tupelo, WTVA being one of those stations, they announced to you that I had been arrested. An entire news segment showed Jim's Little Johnson, the redneck sheriff of Lee County, Mississippi, in Tupelo, giving a hyperbolic press conference with a massive task force behind him for kind of a visual effect. He made this spectacle look as if he just caught bin Laden, or that he personally rescued the world from an alien attack. They were all kind of formal, standing there, serious face, the U.S. flag in the background to enhance the stature of the major arrest, as if from a prolonged and deep and detailed, very serious investigation by this joint task force, literally that was what they were calling it, on crimes against children. And then he tossed around a category of crime generally called molestation. Now that very word, molestation, that's the magic word. You toss that word out there, and it's over. That word in people's mind, it just kind of automatically elicits kind of a certain sinister image. Everyone summons that same kind of imagery in their mind's eye of some poor, doe-eyed, teary-eyed child being abused in some dark, shadowy room somewhere. Well, Jims Johnson, he didn't even bother giving any of the details of exactly what he was claiming was done. The press never even bothered to ask. And it's been over a decade now, and guess what? They still haven't even bothered. None of them said, hey, what are the details? But here's what he did. What he did do was imply things. He mentioned that the accusers, although by the way, they're trained to use the word victims, since that kind of just reinforces that presumption of guilt in a much more insidious word, victims, that they were students in my Tupelo location of Taekwondo Plus. He told the public that the accusers were karate students. Now, a brief aside here. This has actually led to a decades-long kind of gossip, I guess you could say, claiming that these were male students. Little boys is what it implies, making it even more pervy somehow, which, by the way, that's their objective. It's a false implication, though, presuming that since it's a karate school, the students are little boys, because those are the ones that want to learn karate classes and go to it. Now, not for nothing. That's actually a false presumption, because just the opposite was true with me since at least the mid-'90s. In other schools that may be true, but in my school, the bulk of the enrollment always was and had been primarily female, girls and women, especially in Tupelo. They were always the majority of my student body. Even most of my coaches and the red-collar instructors, they were female. So those reporters or those media figures who reported little boys, or anybody who even thought that, they were creating their own narrative in their own minds, and because maybe that's how they wanted it to be. The other thing that he did say was, right now, our investigation has uncovered 2 victims. And there's that word again. But it's going to end up being as many as 8. He actually literally said that. And then he said, it takes some time in cases like these, in these kinds of cases. And note, I want you to, that presumptiveness there, these kinds of cases, for other people to get the courage to come forward. Now, again, I want you to note that use of presumptive language. It's very leading language. It's also very misleading, since come forward has kind of a particular implication. It doesn't sound as convincing to your audience if you actually say what you mean, which would have been something like, it'll take us a while to convince other people to make the accusation we want them to make against this feller that we're going after. That's actually what he would have said if he was being truthful, but you didn't want the truth back then. And if you think about it, that's actually exactly what's being made clear by that kind of dog and pony show. We're not solving some crime here, in other words. We're going after some person, our target, and we need to convince some people to help us get him. Anyway, that's actually how it was left. Except that a few days later, you were all told that I was being held under a bond, $1 million. $1 million bond. A few days, maybe a week after that, if you were still watching the news, heard them tell you that even though I was still sitting in the Jims Little Johnson's Lee County Jail, that I had just been found guilty of, get this, already, of indecent exposure. Then, a few weeks later, you learned that I had made bond and bonded out. And then you heard absolutely nothing until the KC letters a couple months later. That's what you were told. That's you were told in 2013. And for some sad reason, most of you didn't even bother asking any real questions at all. And it's very sad. Very sad. No details ever. Nothing. But that's because you didn't ask. Well, here's what you didn't know. Here's what you don't know. Because you, and when I say you, I want you to note my accusatory finger kind of pointed straight at the press and the media. You didn't bother finding out, even though it's your responsibility. Or the public didn't bother, because nobody told you. No one informed you. So they only let you believe that presumptuous nonsense that they had fed you from the beginning. Plus, to tell you any different, to tell you the complete truth, would actually be an admission that they, that is the press, they co-signed the lie from the beginning. And that's pretty much what they almost always do with Jims Little Johnson. Now, first of all, I want you to note that
This call is from a federal prison.
earlier I said, quote, a category of crimes called molestation, which, by the way, isn't its own thing, though, again, that magic word was really all you probably needed. That magic word kind of completes the smear. But the actual specific charge, which was learned from the bond detention hearing and the indictment, is actually what's called, quote, fondling. Now, that word, too, the fondling, that also brings with it, it also kind of elicits a specific kind of injury, of image in your head, an imagery. Tell me if I'm wrong here. But when you hear fondling, you naturally think of some pervy guy feeling up or touching some poor doe-eyed innocent, which is a silly word to use, I think, child in her no-no zone or his no-no zone, touching their private parts. And then you think of some friendly cop, it has to be a woman, a female, holding up a doll to a little girl saying, hey, can you point to where the mean man touched you? That's the kind of imagery which fondling dredges up, isn't it? It's a word which itself implies a little bit more detail, I think. But, of course, that is the problem, the implying of it. That's not how the actual law actually works. To be legal, there must be a specific allegation as to how some statute, in this case the fondling statute, there must be some specific details as to how that law was violated. In order to be legal, it must be spelled out, those details, in the charging document itself, not in some investigative notes, not in a report on television, but in the court's actual documents, in the arrest affidavit and in the indictment. Otherwise, it's not legal. So let me ask you, especially since we're considering molestation, the worst of the worst of the worst of accusations, let me ask you, what are the details? Seriously, exactly what was being alleged? Go ahead, tell me. Tell me the specifics. The specifics of how that molestation law was violated. Define the specific behavior which fits the, quote, fondling statute. Go ahead. Oh, wait, you can't? That's because you don't know them. You don't know the details. You've never even asked. If you're going to make an accusation, especially that one, then you better damn well have some details, don't you think? Otherwise, exactly what is it that someone is being accused of? How can any defense prepare a case against an accusation which does not allege specific behavior or time or day or means of anything? Well, you can't. There is no defense. There is no, if there's no accusation ever spelled out, is there? If the details are never defined. But you didn't know that because you didn't bother to find out. Well, guess what? Don't worry. I didn't know either. Shocking, yes, and it should be. I didn't know exactly what was being alleged, and I'm the one that was being served with the papers. The fondling statute and the statutory language was in the arrest warrant and in the indictment and then the statutory language as it was written, like in 1976 or 83 or something, but in the indictment, not a single detail, nothing. The indictment was blank. What exactly was it that I was being accused of? I had absolutely no idea. No one else did either. The indictment, with the statutory language listed, was blank. That's what I'm telling you. And none of you noticed? Have none of you noticed that? Seriously, did no one notice that you can't find a single detail anywhere, no newspaper, no nothing, anywhere, outlining exactly what Dusky did to be called, quote-unquote, molestation? None of you noticed that? That language from 1983 or whenever it was written, the statute, the language of the listed statute itself, that should guide you as to what you're looking for. So tell me, what exactly is it that Dusky was being accused of actually doing? Oh, you can't find it? Well, go ahead, try to search. Search. The reason that you can't find it is because it doesn't exist. The indictment is blank. By the way, even the U.S. Supreme Court has said that that's not constitutional. An accusing document, according to law, I hate to be geeky about this, but it must be specific. This indictment is not only vague, which means not constitutional, but it's completely blank. So it literally alleges nothing, which actually meets the required elements of the listed statute. It is blank. So I've never even seen anything like that before. So why? Why did they leave it blank? Why did they not allege in the indictment, which is where it's supposed to be, some specific behavior? Why didn't they allege something? Well, because they couldn't. And that's part of the reason that this case was falling apart, even at the time, because they had absolutely nothing to allege. That's why it fell to pieces. It was because there was no way they could ever take it to trial, and they knew that I was insistent upon that. That's why there was $1 million bond to keep me legally crippled in James Little Johnson's jail, unable to prepare any kind of a trial defense. That subject, and let me tell you something else you didn't know on that subject. There were bond hearings that were scheduled in court to address that $1 million bond. But guess what? Jim Skinny Little Johnson, the sheriff of the jail, he refused to transport me to the courthouse for those the scheduled bond hearings. I didn't even know that my attorney, Lori Basham, I think she's a judge now, that Lori Basham had even scheduled the hearings with the judge, but she was there. Janet, my wife at the time, she was there too. The judge was there. But guess who wasn't there? Guess who didn't go to the bond hearings? Me. Well, why didn't I go? Well, because Jim's little tiny Johnson he refused my transport to the court, to the hearing. Not even the judge himself, Funderburk is his name, not even the judge himself had heard of such a thing. That's some very serious malevolence right there. That's very serious moxie. The judge, I assume it was Funderburk, he said, bring Dusky to this scheduled bond hearing, and James Johnson said, no. That's weaponization, but you didn't know that, did you? Because they didn't report that part in the news, did they? So you didn't know. But that actually exemplifies, with that skinny little dried up foreskin of a man, James Little Johnson, exemplifies that it was never about following the law, or it was never about solving some crime. It was about him versus me. And here's another thing that you didn't know. And these, by the way, these are all factual things. These are
This call is from a federal prison.
documented history here. Here's another thing that you didn't know, along those same lines. The esteemed sheriff of Lee County, the officer of the law, he called every single bail bondsman in Lee County, and he informed them, every single one of them, do not bond Dusky out. Don't. If you do, then your bonding privileges at this jail is going to be canceled. Well, guess what? As a result of that, every single bondsman, and we know this because we knew several bondsmen, and they confirmed this. Every single bondsman in Lee County was afraid to even consider writing my bail bond, specifically because of James Little Johnson's intimidations. His intention was actually to keep me in that jail indefinitely. He said so. He had no qualms about saying that until at least the federal operation hit. His intention was to ensure that I could not defend myself at all. In fact, he actually went so far as to prevent me from meeting, get this is also no joke, to prevent me from meeting with my attorney, Lori Basham, as well. She tried to coordinate meetings with me, her client, but he would not even send a jailer to come open my cell pod door. He, a sheriff, placed obstacles, even restricting my attorney from meeting with her client. By the way, that's a Sixth Amendment violation. It violates law. It violates the Constitution. But you didn't know that either, did you? These are documented facts. The prisoners from another pod, here's what happened. The prisoners from another pod were watching the news one night, and they sent me the message over that apparently the court had, quote-unquote, lowered my charge earlier that day. This was news to me because I hadn't even gone to court that day, so I was confused, and I asked them, well, what are you talking about? And that's when I was informed by those guys in that pod who had been watching the TV news that night that I had been found guilty of indecent exposure by a judge that day, which is bizarre because I still had absolutely no idea. As it turns out, what happened was I was found guilty in absentia of a charge for which I had never even been arrested at a court date that I never even knew I was supposed to be at and wasn't transported to. But you didn't know that, did you? Listen, if you here's how it works. If you don't show up for your court date, guess what? The court finds you guilty. It's called guilty in absentia. But why didn't you show up then, Dusky? The answer is simple. It's two parts. Number one, I didn't know that I was scheduled to be in any court. And number two, Jim's little tiny Johnson didn't transport me to the courthouse. That's what actually happened. But for over a decade now, the media has actually claimed that I was found guilty in 2013 following an arrest in 2012 for indecent exposure. That is completely untrue. That's false. Despite what their story about this, by the way, it still keeps changing. There never was any such arrest in 2012, not for indecent exposure or any other reason. I was never arrested in 2012. That is yet another media falsehood that the press could easily have debunked. Just simply show the record. There isn't one. They could have easily checked on that, but they didn't bother. They just decided to report lies to you. Your trusted media. Nevertheless, the discarded foreskin, Jim Johnson, he didn't allow me to be transported to the court hearing that I didn't know about, so guilty in absentia. Eventually, though, Janet did find a bondsman to write my...
This call is from a federal prison.
...man who was not intimidated by the discarded foreskin, Jim Johnson. That bondsman was someone who had previously advertised in my newspaper. Yes, I owned a newspaper. His name was C.L. Hoyle. And so I bonded out. And by the way, even after I bonded out the discarded foreskin, he tried to keep me there, but he couldn't. So, he kept his promise, which was he retaliated against that bondsman, C.L. Hoyle. But you didn't know that, did you? The foreskin actually yanked C.L.'s name off the bondsman list, which suppressed his ability to write bail bonds in Lee County, or even know of any. This, by the way, is a crime in Mississippi. It's called malicious interference against a business. You want to talk about arrogance? They called me arrogant. You want to talk about arrogance? That's arrogance. You cannot do business in this town, my town, unless you do business the way I tell you to. That's insane. And by the way, this was no secret. It's not like it was a secret. The media could have reported all this, but they didn't. In fact, all of this led to a very public lawsuit that CL filed against the discarded foreskin Jim Johnson. So the record on this matter is actually very clear. But you didn't know that, did you? You didn't bother making those connections. No. Both the discarded foreskin, Jim Johnson, and the press, he hid that from you. Well, you know what? I didn't know about it either. Because you know who told me about it? Who told me about CL's lawsuit after Jim Johnson canceled him for bonding me out? The person who told me was McLean Way, the director of the Kings of Tupelo. He even interviewed CL about that right there in Tupelo. But for some reason, none of that made it into the Netflix series. Even though they knew all about it, they didn't bother telling you what they had uncovered. I don't understand why, but that's a fact. But that's not all. You know who else sued the discarded foreskin Jim Johnson? A man named Ricky Thompson. By the way, that's Judge Ricky Thompson. You know who that is? That's the same 2013 judge who Jim Johnson had coerced into ensuring my bond amount would be set at $1 million. Well, guess what Judge Ricky Thompson's lawsuit against Jim Johnson was about? And by the way, after I made bond, that lawsuit was about Jim Johnson, the foreskin of sheriff of Lee County, refusing to transport prisoners to court. Thompson's court. You can't make this stuff up. This is all documented fact. But the press, WTVA, Netflix, they didn't tell you about that, did they? We know that they knew because, again, they're the ones that told me. That's how I found out about it. Now, all this stuff, everything I'm telling you on this call is not some secret. Just because you didn't know about it, it doesn't make it a secret. It's true that you didn't know about any of this, but not because it's a secret. In fact, every single thing I'm telling you is an actual matter of the public record itself. The public record which anyone could look up. And guess what? Netflix did. If they hadn't, I wouldn't have even known about some of this. But my point is this. This is all something you can easily see for yourselves. You didn't ever need to spend the last decade not knowing the truth, or worse, even repeating the lies, when it's been there all along. And I'm not the one who wrote an indictment or an arrest document, which was blank, by the way, which alleges nothing. I'm not at fault for this. I didn't make a blank indictment that literally does not allege a single damn thing, which violates the listed statute because, you know, it's blank. I didn't do that. The Lee County prosecution machine did. And in 2013, Jim's Little Johnson was the head of it. It isn't all of a sudden. The actual record has been there since 2013, so that's what we should visit next then. Let's visit what actually happened at that time.